We're going to be talking about African mining investment insights, it says here. Fund manager perspectives on opportunities and risks across the continent. And we've got a fantastic panel for you today. We have, sitting next to me here, Richard Crooks, who's investment director at EMR Capital. We have Peter Ledger, who's a portfolio manager with Coronation Funds. We have Rudolf de Bruin, who is the co-founder of AMED Funds. We have Pete Major, who is the Director of Mining at Cadiz Corporate Solutions here in Cape Town, and also an ultra-marathon runner, I believe. He'll tell you about that later. We have Rob Still, who is the Chairman of Pangaea Group, which is a Denham Capital funded private equity group based here in Africa. And we have also Stefan Vermaak, who's Principal Investment Officer at the IFC. So we've got a fantastic array of expertise here on the panel today. So, gentlemen, Africa, discuss. No, not really. Which countries are we seeing great opportunity? Where are the opportunities opening up? Africa often has a reputation, sometimes unfair, sometimes justified, for political risk. But where are there countries across the continent where you're seeing good things are happening, improvements are being made, it's a good place to invest for mining? Richard?
I guess I'll start at the end. We just put our money where our mouth is. We just bought a mine in Zambia, and we see, the copper belt in Zambia as a great address, and long may it stay so. I think there's a huge amount of exploration. The majors are all exploring now in Zambia, and we're looking for more opportunities there as well. So I love Zambia. East Africa, I think, is a great opportunity now. Could become the centre of graphite production globally, and those East African countries for graphite there's a major opportunity there.
Fantastic. Rob, as you're looking at countries for Denham around the continent for opportunities for Denham Capital's Pangaea, where do you like the look of at the moment?
Well, I think you started your question saying, where are opportunities opening up? And I don't think many places in Africa are improving. Maybe some lobby juries are. God knows, maybe this place is going from absolutely stone dead terrible to one level up from stone dead terrible. The rest is a question of geological prospectivity and so forth and so on. It's not that it's improving. So Zambia's fine, but it's not improving. It's Zambia. East Africa, except for Tanzania, which is a disaster.
Just hold it a bit closer.
I mean, East Africa is great, except Tanzania has just committed, shot themselves in the foot for a while. So what's improving? Very little.
How do you see Tanzania playing out?
All the ministers are terrified of the president. All the secretaries are terrified of the president. Nobody knows what to do. Everybody's waiting for something to happen, and we'll have to wait until reality hits the president on the head.
Stefan, I mean, obviously you're at a sort of quasi-governmental organisation. Which governments in Africa are you sort of thinking are making some strides towards improving their regulatory situation?
I think what Rob is saying is, we're following the private sector as IFC, part of the World Bank Group, so we're looking at where the private sector sees opportunities. The reason why we would invest with the private sector is because these governments are also shareholders of the IFC and the World Bank, and in some other way, by us investing with them, there might be some influence that we can have in countries to do the right thing. But I have to agree with what Rob says. Africa is not doing itself good. The fact is, mining is a long-term business. You have to spend capital, and you have to wait for a long time to get your money back. And it's capital intensive. So the governments aren't doing. We're now in a situation where we're maybe on the next step of a mining boom again. Have the governments in Africa really changed their regulations and policies to attract investment? You need the capital. You need foreign investment to be able to do that. On the other hand, you asked me a simple question, which country we want to follow. We followed some of the private sector before, for instance, in Guinea. We've got major exposure there, looking at bauxite, developing those. And we see the government is trying, really, in spite of losing Simandu and a lot of investments in the country and with Ebola, trying to attract investment and doing the kind of right things. Same with Ivory Coast, same with Mali. A lot of countries are trying in this. But I think what we have to start learning is that it's the private sector, the mining companies, and governments that have to work together to try and get a regime that is not looking at a 3-year horizon. You have to look, and when we look at the new opportunities that there are in lithium, in batteries, and graphite, and all of those things, it's maybe the opportunity for mining or African mining countries to go and sit down and see, how am I going to attract the right investments to develop these projects? Because this is now the opportunity. You might miss this again. Because there's some great opportunities in Africa that have never been developed because the regulatory and policy environment was never right. Private sector, as well as IFC, we don't invest if we're not going to get our money back. We are an institution that are working on a commercial return. So if the environment is not correct, we're not going to invest there. So what South Africa is doing, exactly. We're not investing in South Africa. I'm a South African, really want us to invest in the mining sector. I won't get it through our board, I won't get it through our management, we're not going to invest. The policies and regulations are not right. So all I'm saying is there has been some improvements, but I don't think enough. I think government and the mining company have to say, we need resources. Every technology thing that from the cell phone to every battery to what, we will need raw materials. But raw materials, technology is getting better and better. You can go and get it anywhere in the world these days if technology is improving to get it out of the ground. So governments must make it attractive for people to come and invest, but mining companies also have to share some of those benefits with the communities and with people surrounding and with government. And there must be an option to be able to do that. Anyway, long story.
Well, you've raised a lot of points there, which I think we'll get to later on in the discussion. But Peter, tell us a little bit about your fund, your Africa fund. How much of it is mining focused, and which countries around Africa do you most like the look of right now?
Thanks, Leo. So we're a generalist fund, so we buy anything that's listed in Africa and focusing on Africa outside of South Africa. The fund's been around for just short of 10 years, and over that time, I think commodity exposure or companies would have been 20% or less, and at the moment, it's quite modest. It's around the 10% level. By way of return, I mean, we think the continent actually offers a lot of opportunity. I mean, we've done 10% per annum in dollars per year over that time period, which puts us in the top quartile for gem funds. So it's not that there aren't good opportunities out there. I think the commodity space can often be very challenging because good governance and great commodity deposits don't necessarily sit side by side. There was a sense of humor with that. At the moment, we're 40% invested in Egypt. It's a market we like a lot. 18 months ago, you couldn't get your money out. The currency wasn't working. There was a black market that had blown out in a big way. And there's a saying, easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life. And when the new president came in, the military man, he took a whole bunch of hard choices, floated the currency, did away with subsidies, and very tough time for a year where a lot of companies almost went bust. And a year later, that market's now flying and has done incredibly well. And it's actually looking very good. The latest IMF report showing a 5 to 6% growth rate. Government's very accessible, very open to chat, want to know what they can do to help. And so it's a real refreshing experience relative to many other markets. And I think if there are deposits or opportunities there, I mean, we invested in Centamin, in the gold mine in Egypt, and we, on a pure valuation stack up relative to many other consumer opportunities, it looks great. So we do think that there's some interesting opportunities.
But in terms of mining, is the challenge for you the fact that a mining project is typically a very long time period of development, and governments may change and regulations may change throughout that life cycle of development? Whereas something like telecoms or something, it can be they put in the 3G network, whatever.
I mean, I think that has a big role to play. I mean, the other thing that really bugs us is you can't move your mine easily. You can't redefine your business model to work around a difficult government. So, Zimbabwe, we've got Econet and Zimplats. Econet, your CEO hasn't been back in the country for like 10 years. He'll be arrested. Yet they've proven to be a very successful mobile operator, got taxed heavily but have done well. Whereas Zimplats, it's the one big goose you can tax, and when the government runs out of money, you just push your taxes up on that. So it makes it very difficult. So you can own what's probably the best platinum resource in the world, and government will steal that from you, and so that makes it, I think, very difficult.
Rudolf, what are your thoughts across the continent? Anywhere you like the look of?
Yeah, I agree with most of what has been said so far, but I just want to take a slightly different angle. Our approach is to follow the project rather than the country. So we look first at the project and see whether it's a good project and whether this is a project in which we want to invest. There are countries where we would just run away from for up to recently it would be Zimbabwe, and until recently it would be South Africa, and of course places like North Sudan. And, you know, there are Somalia is a non-state, so there are a few places where it's very difficult to operate. But what we would do is, if we see a very good project, if it's not in a country where it's almost impossible to operate, we would take it forward and make it work. We are building a fluorspar mine in South Africa at the moment, and so far it's been going very well, no serious obstacles. There was a report very recently, most of you may have seen this report about political risk in Africa, and all the countries were graded there. And but one thing that stood out for me was the authors of the report said, when a country has low political risk, it doesn't mean it's a good place to invest, because the projects might not be good. And the fact that a country is on the bottom of the list as being very risky doesn't mean you must not invest. If you can back a very good management team who know their way around that country, you can still invest. So for us, the emphasis is always to try and back the project and see whether we can work in that country, rather than to look for a nice country and then look for a project.
You've all painted Peter, I'll bring you in a second on this, but you've all painted a fairly gloomy picture of the African sort of regulatory and political situation. But as Rudolf says, if there's a good asset there, you want to get in there and you want to be able to develop it. What are some strategies you can take for dealing with the political risk that exists and making a success of a project? Pete, do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, we've taken the exact opposite view of Rudolf, so I guess we'll see who's right. I've been doing this 12 years. First few years, yes, I was like Rudolf. I'm a mining engineer, and I fell in love with the project and thought, we'll handle all the other risks. And that's not possible. The other risks are usually out of your hands, whereas the mine itself is almost always under your control. So when someone brings us a project now, the first thing I find out what country it's in. And if it's not a country we're comfortable, which is most of the ones in Africa, I say, thanks, but no thanks. Don't even tell me how good it is, because I'm not going to change my mind. So our most favorable country, it has been Zambia. Botswana, we find, has the best policy, is the most honest. We just don't find many good deposits there of minerals. You know, when someone brings us a coal deposit or a diamond, we were the last people to see it. It's usually not that great, but working with the government there is great. We find Namibia, unfortunately, has been going more and more like South Africa. We gave up on Zimbabwe quite a few years ago after putting a lot of work in there, because it was just getting worse and worse every year. So maybe this year it's not going to get worse, but it's going to have to get a lot better. What can governments do? I asked for a couple slides here. You know, I don't want to spend time on them. I just showed 4 slides, though, of what governments can do and the effect it'll have. Here's the DRC, and you can call it regime change, you can call it policy change, but you can see what happened when they changed their policy in the 70s. Production started going down, no capex was spent, and it didn't change until their policy changed. And yes, it did have the incentive of good prices to make the good prices made investors put a few billion more than they did with policy. But these are tens of billions of dollars that went in this country. Next slide. Zambia, almost a carbon copy of DRC. You know, decent policies up until the 70s. The nationalization just destroyed everything. And then when they got so sick of having no jobs, no production, they threw the bums out. They totally changed their mining code, and they got tens of billions of dollars. Next slide. This is a country that thinks it knows better than everybody else, so it's going to keep the same bad policy in until it can go to zero. and then they might think about changing their policy. And the fourth slide. Now Chile had good policies in for nearly 100 years. But by 1970, they didn't like being ranked alongside Zambia and the DRC. So they also changed their policy, but they found out a policy change doesn't have to be bad, it can actually be good. And that's what Chile did. So by changing their policy from good to better, they now produce more money from copper than all of South Africa's minerals put together. So we're actually not a mining giant anymore, we're a mining pygmy, you know? Here's Chile, half our population, a third our population, and I think half of that rides llamas all day, and they produce more out of copper because they've got good policy, and yes, they've got deposits. But without the policy and legislation and government, you can't get production.
Anyone have any comments on these slides? Any?
Well, I'll only have one comment. That is, my role nowadays, I'm non-executive at Pangaea. I'm a global partner with Denham. And I can tell you the pleasure of the policies in Chile, in Peru, in Australia, up to a point, they've got Australians there, you know, in Canada and so forth and so on, compared to just about anywhere you operate in Africa is quite challenging. But I'd like to pick up what Rudolf said. Of course, it's a balance between the potential of the country and the risks of policy and policy change. Hell, if everybody in the world had the same policies and the same fiscal environment, we'd all be doing exploration in the DRC, wouldn't we? I mean, that is, without a question, probably the most prospective place in the world. But unfortunately, it's quite a tough place, so you have to balance how good the project is, and it's got to be very, very good before you go in, but we go in because it's very good. And right now, the DRC is improving dramatically in many areas, and what are they doing? They're going to cause a lot of drama by changing the code again. Just as they're starting to recover, just as they're starting to bring money in, they're changing the code. Now, what is it about the world that the world doesn't stand up and talk truth to power and say, stop this shit? You're actually doing yourself a disservice. Let's go back to the fundamentals. When you develop a project in a difficult part of the world, you are putting a flagstone, a great big ivory tower of first world goodies in the middle of a deprived area. It's very tough. People around that project sit there, they don't have good lifestyles, they look at the cars going in and out of the mine, people having good jobs, and they say, gee, what am I getting out of this? And then the taxes from the mine, guess where they go? They go to the head office, they go to the capital city, 1,500 miles away, kilometers away, whatever. And how much comes home to mummy? Bugger all. And they say, hang on, what's this for me? What is this doing for my life? So I was on the wrong end of a very badly done inquiry into mines some years ago, done by a part of the Soros group. And they had to go at Sasol, and they had to go at Zimplats, and they had to go at a mine in Zambia that I was involved in, one in DRC. And they spoke complete nonsense. And, but, you know, it sticks because you can say what you like. Anyway, we sat them down and we said, all right, let us get our communities in, let them talk about whether you were right. And, you know, it was a long story, but of course, once it's printed, you never get it back. To me, there's nothing you can do virtually about a government. Very little. You know, what you can do is get the immediate community on your sides. And that is absolutely a sine qua non. You don't get that right, you're going to lose. Now, that doesn't mean to say you have to pay them over much or build them a university, which is inappropriate. And we can go into great detail about what needs to be done there. But you must deal with the local community. And that means find out who they are, make sure that whoever represents them is agreed to represent them, find out what they want, explain to them what you've got, come up with a program, and leverage it. They want to do something. Oftentimes, they don't want your money. They want you to be able to design something, procure some equipment, find something out for them, do something for them, and often bring in external NGO money to help. You don't have the community on side, you do. And in places like difficult places, project places, where the project is good, community is very important. Bottom line.
Yeah, okay.
If I think back, in the 80s and 90s, all the general managers, or the majority of general managers, mine managers I spoke with, what's your biggest problem? It was the unions. You know, Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC. All through the 90s, yeah, the unions is still the biggest problem. But in the new millennium, it very soon the unions didn't die down, but now the government's the biggest problem. The legislation, the Mining Act, the BEE, the charter. So they said the unions are still giving us hell, Pete, probably more than even before, but it's superseded by government. And when we could see that in the papers and all the legislation, Charter 2, now Charter 3. But the last 3 years, the managers I've spoken to said those two problems are superseded by another one called the community. And they said, it is our worst problem by far because it's immediate. It's on our doorstep. They'll set things on fire. They'll block the roads daily. What's even harder is we don't know who to talk to, or you battle, like Rob said. Find out who are the leaders, find out what they want. But a lot of that community, I fear here in this country, it's been government aroused because the government has failed to deliver, and so they're telling the communities, go to the mines. The mines owe you houses. They owe you jobs. The mines must give you water. So it's like government's inflaming the communities here. As Rob said, you definitely can't work with the communities are against you. You'll battle with the unions, you'll battle with legislation, but the communities just stop you in your tracks. And we've seen that with Pan-African. They can't even get a tailings dam going. The community is virtually a mafia now. They say you will deal with us, the thugs that come there. So
The tailings dam in the case of Pan-African, they've got to pay a bribe to the person who's just become the vice president of South Africa, or is about to become, excuse me.
But how do you deal? I mean, how much responsibility does the mining industry, does the private sector have to take for this sort of culture of corruption, shall we say? So if you start saying, okay, well, I'm going to deal with the community, I'm going to build you some houses, I'm going to maybe give you some compensation for your loss of farmland and all this sort of stuff, suddenly everyone else starts coming out of the woodwork.
Let's talk about how much responsibility you take for corruption. There's nobody sits here who can afford to get involved with corruption. Corruption is, I don't care what you talk about 5 or 10 or 20, 30 years ago. Maybe there was, maybe there was. Bottom line is, nobody sitting here can afford to even contemplate corruption. It's not on the agenda. Can't be done. We have two powerful acts out there, even if we were inclined in that direction. So I don't think that's the issue. The issue is expectation, first and third world combinations, and governments. Governments are the corrupt ones.
But also, at the same time, I mean, we've obviously got some great people here. We've got some great companies out there. There are other companies in the world, other mining companies in the world, who don't mind a bit of paying a bit of bribes. How do we compete? How can we compete with those sort of people?
Well, you just can't do it. You can't compete. You just can't pay a bribe. It's simple. Not that we ever contemplated it, but it's a sine qua non. I agree. It's just...
Absolutely.
If you want to kill your business, pay a bribe. That's as simple as that. But if I can just come back to the main point. You know, we've had universities training geologists. Then we've had universities training mining engineers. And we train lawyers, we train accountants. But what we need to do now is train communicators, because there's a lot of communication needing to happen between communities and mining companies. I agree with Rob. It's not always easy to find out who you should talk to. Very often, that's our experience. You talk to one group, then another group. These communities are getting clever, and they also form groups because it's almost like political parties. You know, they try to get support from the community, and another group tries to get support, and they play each other off against they play it off against each other. So what you need to do is you need to get a solid, good advisor, very good in communication on your side. That's what we sort of do. We try to get guys who understand that particular community, who can advise us, these are the right people to talk to, and how you deal with these communities.
But dealing with those advisors can be tricky, can't it? I mean, you've stories recently, obviously, of companies, big Western companies going into DRC or something like that. They think they've got an advisor. They say, he goes, I can sort out the local community. I can sort out your permitting, all this sort of stuff. A few years down the track, it turns out, he's been paying off people. How do you deal with that? I mean, how can you trust middlemen? It's, is there anything you can do?
You pay the advisor $2 million a month for his services, probably is handing it over to somebody else. Quite seriously, we have a project in a difficult area, and we spent 1.5 years just dealing, not with what the community was going to get, but who is the community. And it took a year and a half for them to agree that the following people represent them, and they had an election in the overall community. And we set up a whole structure, a whole mandate, and they agreed that these guys represented them. You don't start like that, they're all going to represent.
So just from the overseas perspective, we've got a toolkit on our website, and you're happy to come and see us as well. But we've got specialists that are looking at exactly this, talking to the people surrounding a mine, what is their needs, understanding what that is. That is the problem with natural resources. It is the birthright of the people that live there. It's their land, how it's formulated. They want to share in that prosperity. They have to, and it has to be fair if you want to mine, and that's part of your cost. So you have to go and see what it is to be able to let them share in that benefit. If you can't pay them the benefit, rather not do the mine. You have to get them involved in that, see what their needs are, and not just like building a school, because that's not necessarily what they want. Talk to them, have interaction with the different tribe leaders, who is the real leaders, and sometimes that takes a very long period of time, and I think it's becoming more and more important to do that.
I think that there is a potential model that works, and we've seen it in Zambia. I think a lot of the mining codes were set up with World Bank guidance, but essentially the government was sort of too excluded and sort of the enemy, and the only interaction really is through the tax authority or the finance ministry. In Zambia, you've got a partner, an active partner, ZCCMH Investment Holdings, who sit on the board. They're inside the tent. They see the decisions that are being made. They see the difficulties that, the challenges that mines have and face. And so they kind of understand it, whereas I think there's a lot of, mining codes in Africa that don't allow that sort of transparency and make the government a real stakeholder.
Absolutely. Let's just talk a little bit about the sort of commodities that are found in Africa and the opportunities that we have going forward. Obviously, at the moment, everyone's talking about copper, electric vehicles, battery materials, renewable energy, and all of the materials that need to go into that. Africa, obviously, wonderfully rich in copper, in graphite, in cobalt, obviously. How can Africa really take advantage of the demand, the growing demand for these materials, and make sure that some of the benefit does come back to the country rather than causing more problems? Pete.
Okay, this could be Major's theory, but I've definitely noticed whatever commodity starts running, our phone starts ringing, we start getting more emails, and if it keeps running, people even fly out to visit. And all of a sudden, whatever country that commodity is found in, it's diminished. Its risk diminished is in proportion to how the commodity is running. So whether it's lithium or graphite, whatever that commodity is, if it really starts running, I'd say noticeably above its long-term average. Yeah, lithium kneecaps. Look, I think that's a bit simplistic, but I've definitely seen it from my side of the desk for 12 years. Countries, DRC, because cobalt's running, the Canadians and Australians that call us, that come and visit, they just want DRC. I'm telling you, if I had that deposit in South Africa, they wouldn't want it. But DRC is now more popular than I've ever seen it, just because it's got cobalt. So people forget there's no election risk.
But the question is different. The DRC faces a classic situation. Cobalt's running. The worst thing the DRC can allow is the cobalt price to go up 400%, because the world will find substitutes as sure as God made green apples. What the DRC should be doing, instead of creating a supercharge on cobalt, which is their first reaction, let's tax it, they should be improving their fiscal environment, inviting people to treat cobalt, supplying the world with cobalt, making sure they're a reliable supplier, and then they will, over a 50-year period, get a massive dividend out of cobalt. What will happen is that we one day wonder, cobalt price will go through the ceiling, somebody will find it somewhere else because they'll put a lot of money in, say anything but the DRC, or people will engineer cobalt out of the equation. One of the two.
Any other comments from the panel? I mean, Richard, obviously you mentioned earlier when we were having a chat, East Africa and the opportunity in graphite.
Yeah, the quality of the graphite deposits in East Africa is, the best in the world. So there's a real opportunity for, Mozambique through, Malawi, Tanzania, to corner that industry and not just be a quarry to ship off concentrate to the developing battery makers. So why not incentivize companies to do some downstream value adding in East Africa? I think that's a model that should be explored. Not necessarily force the primary producer to do the value adding, but to encourage some sort of technology players to come and set up and establish industries in Dar es Salaam or in Mozambique, wherever.
What would be the model to follow? I mean, in terms of adding value, beneficiation, adding value to the raw materials, and the argument about whether it should just be shipped off to China or whether you should try and add value in country. Where are some good examples of where countries have been successful in adding value to their raw materials?
All the aluminium smelters that were set up with power subsidies. I mean, that was one example of sort of in-country beneficiation.
So I think the problem with Africa with beneficiation is, again, on policy and regulation and certainty. So even the aluminium smelters were built in Mozambique because of excess power in South Africa, but it was structured in such a way that the bauxite would come from another country, and you would have an offtake for your raw material or for your finished product to another country. So no one wants to take the risk of having their product mined in a country and beneficiated if there's no certainty on the future of the country going forward, and how certain is regulation and policy. So sometimes for me it's not just about mining. If you've got not the right policy and regulation regarding mining, you're also discouraging other investments coming in your country because you don't have that long-term certainty for investors. I mean, maybe I'm making it too simple, but that's what it is. I think beneficiation will happen if you are successfully mining and you're doing that, and at a stage you look at the cost benefits of doing it, and the private sector will grab that opportunity and do it if there's the right environment to be able to do it. But to put it in legislation is very difficult because now someone has to look at the mine and he has to beneficiate, and the capital he has to spend without having the certainty just makes it a no-go. Sometimes I wonder why African governments are doing what they're doing. Rather get the investment in and then start chipping away from it. But just to chase the investment before you even got it, it just doesn't make sense.
There's a lovely case at the moment in Zimbabwe. Yet another finance minister or president in Africa saying, oh, you must beneficiate. Our own Minister of Trade and Industry is a particularly moronic on that subject. Brain dead and the rest. Now in Zim they've said you've got to beneficiate, must beneficiate. And in platinum, if you don't beneficiate, we will charge a 15% premium on the export of your concentrate because you're not smelting it. Recently, the mining industry in Zimbabwe had the ability to be able to explain to the minister concerned that if they did invest in the downstream beneficiation, they would lose money and the country would lose money, and the dividend check and the tax check over 20 years would be materially less. So it's not a simple thing. Your question is a good one. Where does beneficiation pay, or where has it paid? Long-term certainty creates environments where people can spend these things. Forcing people to beneficiate is somber kaka.
Just to mix it up, because we've got 6 minutes left, Joe. I mean, as somebody who looks across the board in terms of different companies, I mean, there are many businesses that we see that make super profits. And it's generally, it's a big conversation with a company that's, it's got operating margins of 35%, say it's a pharmaceutical business selling generics, no research, and you ask, you shouldn't be making profits like that, they should be 20%, and explain to me, why this is sustainable, because over time, it's the kind of business where competition will come in, and unless there's some peculiar licensing set up, normal competition comes in. In mining, my understanding it's a bit different, where you get a big cycle, you've got a great deposit, now you're making margins of 70% in a spectacular period of time. If I was in government watching this massive stream of cash leaving the country, I'd be thinking, how do we make sure we get more of that? And it's an overreaction to a very short-term situation, and it undermines a long-term, industry. And so sort of my question is, I mean, it's such an obvious cause and effect that's happening here. Yet we're so surprised when governments say, look, we need you to beneficiate because this is a very simplistic way of forcing you to keep money in the country. And what's the alternative to something like that where you can head that off?
Well, yeah. What is the alternative? I mean, you can either tax the raw material or you can force them to beneficiate. Are there any other? Is there a third way? Hey.
This government always seems to come with sticks, and you can never find any carrots. And if you look at the examples, they talk beneficiation all the time, as Rob said, as nauseum. In the meantime, they're cranking up the electricity price 200, 300, 400, 500% the last 12 years. 500% increase. So anybody who invested in beneficiation has been wiped out financially. So until they start putting themselves in the shoes of somebody investing, and our port charges are insane. Our rail charges aren't cheap. That's why we got so many pirate trucks tearing up the roads. So your government policy has to reflect what you believe. And they obviously don't believe in beneficiation because their policy reflects that through all the parastatals. Now, I know Rob Davies likes bragging up how this auto industry is such great value add, but whether they're getting 10, 15, it's in the tens of billions in RAND subsidies every year. And yet, if you look at the states, they're 50 independent little countries. But look at the way the individual states fight to get that Korean auto plant. Tennessee will offer them 10-year tax holiday. Then West Virginia finds out. They said, no, we'll give you a 20-year tax holiday. And then North Carolina says, bullshit. We're going to give you free utilities, free land, no taxes. They compete. Those are carrots to bring investment. But we're still running on the stick mentality. And it means there's no investment.
Look at Botswana's diamond polishing. That's maybe an example. Let's talk about that.
Go ahead.
I'm just throwing it out there. I mean, Botswana held a certain gentleman's equipment by the what's-her-names and said, you will process your diamonds in Botswana, otherwise we won't renew your license. Now, is that the right thing to have done? They had a monopoly of diamond flow to some extent. So, I don't know. The Botswanans have tended to be a bit smarter than most, and they got away with it, and maybe it was okay. I don't know. And it was the end of the 25-year license, so they weren't changing the rules. It was a renewal.
But are there any countries out there who are starting to look at carrots over sticks?
Well, what about Rwanda? Does that count? Well, that's why.
There we go. Do we have any questions from the audience? I'm sure there are some interesting questions out there going forward. Anybody? Stick up a hand if you have a question for us. We have a question at the back here. Can I get a microphone over?
Testing. Just a quick question. Just how do you deal with the Chinese when you say that as Western companies we can't entertain paying bribes, but we all know that they're quite prolific here in Africa, and how do we mitigate that?
Look, we've had that example in a country north of us and in this own country. We just try to go on publicity and one-to-one conversation with the people that make decisions. We say, here's proof your people are taking a Chinese bribe, and you tell us you're not in love with just the Chinese taking over, and this is what we've offered. And as Rob says, you don't have to pay a bribe. You say, we will bring this many jobs, this much investment, we'll build this plant, but we want a surety that we've got this. So I think you have to be your own publicist or hire a good publicist when you believe you've lost out because of a bribe, and take them to court. If you think you got evidence, take them to court. And a lot of these countries, they'll back down. If you got a good case, good lawyer, good publicity, you can do it. But yeah, you don't get in the game of competing. You're going to pay one bribe higher.
But listen, the Chinese don't play bribes in a conventional way. I mean, let's be quite blunt. The Chinese go to the head of the government and say, would you like some roads, and how about a few universities and some airports, and what about a nice new swimming pool? And then somewhere else they get a resource, and the two are not linked. I had a case many years ago where we were selling to a Brazilian company, and a certain parastatal in the DRC wanted to blackmail us to pay them a bunch of money. They had a preemptive right, which didn't really exist, long story. They wanted $100 million, which translated means about 5. And I went to the Brazilian counterparts and said, we've got a problem, Houston. These guys are causing shit, they're blocking the deal. And the Brazilians said, oh, don't worry. We'll send our president for lunch with their president, we'll sort it. I said, that's nice. Anyway, a week or two later, the Brazilians fell off the wagon and in came the Chinese. I said, Houston, we have a problem. These guys want some money, what do we do about it? The Chinese said, whoa, don't even talk about it. I said, we've got to do something about it. We've got to fix this problem. I'm not suggesting we pay any money, but we've got to fix it. We've got to fix it. They said, don't even talk to me. I got chatting to this Chinese guy and I said, what's the problem? He said, well, for me to give you permission to do anything, build a school, I got to go to my boss and I'm going to lose face. And he's going to go to his boss and he's going to lose face. And he's going to go to the top boss and he's going to lose face. So we're not even going to go there. But one day our president will come and build an airport. So you don't actually get the direct bribery the way you're thinking about it. It doesn't happen. It's quite interesting. The Chinese do it in a different way, in my experience.
And also, are you possibly seeing changes, given that Xi Jinping has, across in mainland China, anti-corruption is all the rage right now. And they're really, I guess, trying to clean up a lot of things. Are you seeing that flowing through into companies who are making overseas investments? I mean, we talk to a lot of them in Hong Kong. They all seem like straight-up guys, stand-up guys. So are we seeing some changes coming through? Is that ancient history now?
Look, we've seen it in the last 12 months. There's no more of this gifts. A lot of the Chinese and Koreans, they bring little boxes and you bring cakes and gifts. And I think that was more for show. But it's gone. It's totally gone. And they've told us corruption is a big issue over there. And so I think it's not policy to pay bribes. And I think, as Rob said, in heads of state been negotiating deals like that. That's why you got trade commissioners,
We never saw it.
consulates.
Back in China, the 1 carat diamond problem, you know about that, of course. That came to an end. But that's another story. That's a bit like the gift. Nice 1 carat diamond gift. But they became for what? We've never seen bribes at that level, ever.
I think we have to distinguish two cases here. Private Chinese companies and state-owned Chinese companies. I think what we've been discussing is state-owned Chinese companies. But you still see Chinese private companies. There was a recent case of Mag Industries. They were listed on the TSX. And you may have seen the Royal Canadian Police raided their offices, I think, in Toronto. And the Chinese actually documented all the bribes very nicely in their books. So when these guys raided their offices, it was all there. They actually put it in writing. And that company is not anymore. It was delisted, and they suffered the consequences that other private company or privately owned companies would suffer. So Chinese-owned private companies, they have the same problems, that they just can't be involved in bribery, and they get penalized. But that's very different from the state-owned companies, where they do the kind of thing that Rob has explained, where the government builds an airport. One of my friends is very high in the World Trade Organization, and I had a chat to him about the way China does business. And I think we all know China is China Inc. They work like a company. And a state-owned company would do something here, but it's like in the same organization, another leg of that organization would build an airport. And that's the way they play the game. So it's very difficult for us to compete against China Inc. So,
but I guess we're seeing things slowly changing with these new anti-corruption drives. Surely that will eventually feed through into things happening on the ground here, which hopefully would discourage people from seeking bribes and things like that, and hopefully clamp down on the corruption here, and hopefully make it a better situation for people to invest in Africa. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I know you've got probably loads more to say. It's a fantastic group of people there on the panel, really lively discussion. Thank you very much. Big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.